And what's coming up this Sunday? Easter, right? So it's a very appropriate time to talk about the resurrection and the basis for our faith, really, for anyone who may be Christians here. Okay, so the question I'm going to ask, though, is going to be an academic question. You could think of this as almost scientific as well, almost like the science of history. So this question it's not going to be so much theology and spirituality today. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of academics. Is there historical evidence that it actually happened? And would this be something that even someone who doesn't have a religious background or interest, would they be able to relate to this? And would they be able to see evidence for the resurrection? So kind of step outside of your Christian faith for a minute and think about it. Is there objective evidence for the resurrection? But before we get into that, I want to, it's good to think about why does it matter, right? So if the resurrection happened, then, so what? Or why does it matter whether it did or didn't happen? Well, first of all, if it did happen, then you could pretty much bank on this, right? If the resurrection happened, then Jesus is the Son of God, and Christianity is the truth about the universe, about the world. Okay, so there's an objective reason to believe that. So again, this is something that even you could tell, even an unbelieving person would almost be compelled in a sense, or convinced to believing that the Christian faith is correct. But the other thing, the other side of the coin is, why do you go to church, right? Why do you go to church every week? Why do you pray? Why do you read the Bible? Well, if Christ isn't risen, if the resurrection never happened, then going to church is pointless, right? I mean, it's community. I guess it's great. You get to interact with other people. That's good. But the Bible itself says, if Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty and your faith is also empty. Okay, so the entire Christian faith is pointless if Jesus actually didn't rise from the dead. If this isn't a real event of history. Okay, so it's important. You might be sitting there and thinking, well, why do I have to worry about this? I pray and I do ministry and all this, and why do I have to worry about the evidence for the resurrection? Well, here's why. I mean, if it's true, then you have a basis for your faith, but if it's not true, then there's no point to even do anything related to your faith, right? The other reason is, if the resurrection happened, then there is almost like a scientific basis for believing in life after death. Okay, so the scientifically supported hope for the afterlife. Okay, so obviously death is a really tragic experience of life. We have people that we care about that have passed away. We're going to die someday. But if the resurrection is true, then there's a scientifically warranted hope. It's not wishful thinking, but there's a scientifically warranted hope for hope, after the grave. Okay? And then also, all of your personal suffering in this world will be healed eventually. Okay, that's another thing we can bank on, at least for those who, put their faith in Christ. So that's another important point, if the resurrection is true. One other thing, I forgot to add this, is, of course, if the resurrection is true, then there is a judgment day as well. And if you read in Acts, and that's actually what I forgot to pull that up, but in Acts, the Apostle Paul is preaching, and he says that there's going to be a day in which the world is judged by Jesus Christ, and God has given assurance of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. Okay, so there's a day of judgment. That's not supposed to be scary if you put your trust in Christ, obviously, but it's still good to be aware of that. If someone doesn't know Christ and Christ is real, then you're going to have to answer to the Creator one day. So if the resurrection is true, then you can pretty much be certain there's going to be a time where you're going to stand before God. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons to examine this question, right? And here's another big one here. If you look around the world, you look at crime, and you read history, it doesn't look like justice always is really exacted, right? So if the resurrection is real, then we can be confident that there will be ultimate justice in the end. So this is an encouraging thought, so everything will be balanced in the universe in the end. All right, now a couple objections. So someone might think, maybe even some Christians might think, well, you can't prove this religious statement, or you can't prove this spiritual thing, right? You can't prove the resurrection happened. Well, the thing is, though, for most things in life, we don't prove everything before we go out and try it, right? So when you get in your car in the morning, you don't prove that you're not going to get into an accident. You don't have time to prove that. When you go across the bridge, you don't prove that the bridge is sturdy. Okay, before you take a bite of food, you don't prove that you're not going to get food poisoning. Okay, so for most things in life, we actually don't require that high level of, we don't require absolute proof for anything. Okay, so what we do, some examples again, walking over a bridge, eating unhealthy food, right? I mean, we do that even though we know it's not good. Well, some people do. I know a lot of people eat healthy too, which is even better. So if we don't prove it, what do? We mostly make decisions based on reasonableness, right? So the rational person or the reasonable person looks at the weight of the evidence, kind of where the evidence points overall. Okay, so why would we drive over a bridge? Well, because we see other cars driving over a bridge and we don't see any evidence that the bridge is unstable. So we make a reasonable choice. Okay, so this is all that I am asking, is that when we look at the evidence for the resurrection, does the weight of the evidence lean toward the resurrection? Okay, and that's what I'm going to argue in this presentation. Okay, this might be another concern that some people have. So let me just talk to people who are specifically Christians at this point. So if you're a Christian, if you're not a Christian here and all that, that's great too, because I encourage you to keep an open mind. But if you are a Christian, this might be a concern of some people. If you're spending all this time examining evidence, does that kind of detract from your personal relationship? You might think back where you dedicated your life to Christ, and you're thinking, well, I didn't read a scholarly book in the resurrection, and then I became a Christian or an Adventist or whatever. I actually just prayed. It was a connection with God. Okay, so does this kind of detract from that, saying, well, I have to look at the historical evidence? No, it doesn't detract from it at all. What it does is it provides kind of an objective confirmation of your experience. Okay, so people have a lot of experiences. People that take drugs, for example, might have an experience where they see something. Okay, so is that experience objectively real? Did that actually happen in the real world? No, it didn't happen, right? So, there are some religions out there, and some of you may have heard of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormonism, and again, I'm not getting down on anyone or trying to be offensive to anyone's, if that's where you stand, but this idea that the only thing you need to verify your faith is just a personal experience or a feeling, burning the bosom, or some feeling, that could be a little bit risky, right? If you don't have any objective evidence supporting that view. Okay, so if there isn't some sort of objective standard that we can look at, then how do we know that Christianity is true versus Mormonism or versus Islam? Right? We need some sort of objective standard to kind of discriminate between those and find out what the truth is. Okay, so it doesn't detract from your personal time of prayer when God is working in your life, or when you see God answering prayer. It doesn't detract from that at all. It just reminds you, it confirms, okay, this is actually a real thing. It's not just in my head. Okay, and that's good to have that. It can strengthen your faith. The other reason it's important is because it provides a reason to other people for believing the gospel. So if you're talking to a friend or family member or anyone really, and you're trying to convince them, hey, look, you got to accept Jesus is going to be great. Your life is going to, not necessarily your life is going to improve, but you're going to it's going to be a good thing, a good choice to accept Jesus, to get to know the Creator. And they'll say, well, why should I believe that if they weren't raised in a Christian or Adventist home, right? They'll say, why should I believe that? Well, and you say, well, because I prayed one day and Jesus came into my heart. Okay, and that's true and that's good, but that's not very convincing to people who don't already have that bias or that background in faith. Okay, so this provides, showing historical evidence for the resurrection provides a reason to convince others to come to Jesus, which is going to be really the best thing for them, right? So this is another reason why this is a good, it doesn't detract from your personal relationship. It actually has some benefit. All right, so now before I actually get into the case or the evidence for the resurrection, we have to kind of examine our assumptions. This is always good. When we're trying to determine whether something is likely to be true or not, it's important to try to examine what assumptions do we have to make. Okay, do we have to assume different things that, because if you're talking to someone who doesn't agree or doesn't already believe in Christianity, they'll attack you and say, well, the Bible says the resurrection happened, but I don't believe the Bible. So why should I believe it? Okay, so let's examine what assumptions we would have to make, because I'm going to actually say that we don't have to make this assumption to come to the conclusion that the resurrection happened. Okay. Okay, I'm not saying this isn't true. In my opinion, yes, this is my opinion. The Bible is the Word of God. But when I'm making my case today, we don't have to assume the Bible is the Word of God to make the case. Okay, so again, just assume. We don't have to start with that assumption. Put that aside for now. We don't have to assume that the Bible is inerrant, or that the New Testament, everything the New Testament says is 100% accurate. You don't have to assume that. Okay, and again, I do believe that this is correct. This doctrine is correct. But in making the case, you don't have to assume that this is the case. You don't even have to assume that we know God exists. Okay, it might sound kind of strange. You don't have to say, well, we're absolutely certain God exists. Okay, instead, really the only assumption you have to make is very minimal. Just assume that it's possible that God exists. Okay, that's a pretty modest assumption. Okay, so you could just ask your friend or someone, is it at least possible that God exists? Most people would probably say yes. There are some people who are like, no, I'm pretty sure there is no God. But most people would say, yeah, it's at least possible that God exists. Okay, so you only have to start with this modest assumption to make the case I'm going to make in a couple minutes. Okay, and here's another assumption that's important. You don't want to go on the other end of the extreme where you're biased on the other side too. Okay, right? So, as a scientist, I want to be objective. I want to give everything, in a sense, equal weight. I want to look at things in an unbiased fashion. So, we can do that as well. So, just because there are documents in favor of the resurrection doesn't mean we should ignore them either. Okay, so we can just make this assumption that the documents of the New Testament can be treated like any other historical document. I think that's completely reasonable. Yeah, there's a question in the back there.
Why do you think the assumption it's possible that God exists is necessary?
Okay, so he was asking why is this a necessary assumption? Because if someone assumes that God does not exist, and they say that it's impossible that he exists, then having a miracle occur is an impossibility. Okay, so that's kind of the idea here. So if God definitely doesn't exist or probably doesn't exist, then the resurrection is a miraculous event, and that's an impossible conclusion. Okay, and in fact, that's what a lot of scholars today that study the resurrection, that's kind of how they view it. They say, well, we can't really assume a miracle happened, so we got to look at all other possible hypotheses. Okay, so all I'm saying is that at least be open-minded to the possibility there is a God. Okay, so that's kind of the way I look at it. Now you could even start with the assumption God may not exist, or God probably doesn't exist. Even if you start with that assumption, but you're at least open-minded, the evidence for the resurrection can persuade you that a miracle did happen and therefore God does exist. So, I'm trying not to make it too complex, but that's kind of the fundamental reason why I was saying that that's a good assumption. So in other words, if someone did not, I guess the importance of saying this is if someone is not listening to any of your explanations or reasons for believing the resurrection, just ask them, say, can you at least acknowledge it's possible that God exists? And if it is, then it's possible that a miracle can happen, right? Okay, so sometimes other people will not have this assumption, and that can kind of be a block. It can block them from accepting the resurrection. Okay, so this is why I'm encouraging everyone at least just think about it in a modest sense. Okay, so now with that aside, let's just look at what history says. So there's only a couple historical facts that I'm going to address here. And then when you put these facts together, so one way to think of the case for the resurrection is let's look at what can be established through history. Okay, so what do majority of scholars agree with? And that doesn't make it right, I'm not saying that, but what does a majority of scholars agree with based on the historical evidence? Okay, so what's something that's most likely happened in history? Okay, and then when we put all those facts together, how can we explain all those facts? What hypothesis will explain it? So there's a little bit of a scientific approach here. All right, so first let's look at the facts of history that even non-Christian and non-religious scholars will agree with. Okay, the first one is that Jesus died by crucifixion. And some of the evidence for that is, I'm even using non-biblical sources for some examples. So Polycarp, he was a Christian, but he was also really close to Jesus's peers. Okay, so he was really close to the events, so he would know kind of what's, he was close to he was alive around the time of the events, or he was close to the time of the events, so he kind of knows, what may have happened, right? He did state that Jesus died on a cross. Okay, another, we call them church fathers, Ignatius, he says in one of his letters, he was truly persecuted under Pontius Pilate, he was truly crucified, and he died. Okay, so this is, again, these are people that are close to the events that are saying that this is what happened. So they would have known whether or not, this was a legend. Okay. There are other non-Christian sources that are not even people that didn't even believe in Christianity, historians of the time. For example, Josephus. Many of you probably heard of Josephus. He's a Jewish historian, so he wasn't pro-Jesus. If anything, he would have been biased against Jesus. He says, about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man. Upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to a cross. Okay, so this is a historian, non-Christian historian. He says that Jesus was crucified. Tacitus was another one. He was a completely secular historian. He said, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on Christians. And then he says here, Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Okay, so we have a historian here that also confirms that there was an individual named Jesus who was crucified. Okay, and then there's a couple other ones. Lucian and even the Talmud, a Jewish writing. Okay, so notice I haven't even brought up the four Gospels yet. So this isn't even from the Bible yet, and we have a really good case that there probably was an individual named Jesus who was crucified. If you add the Gospels onto that, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then other letters from Paul, then there's a pretty strong historical basis that there was a person named Jesus who was crucified and died by crucifixion. Okay, so there's a pretty good case to be made here. Okay, so we can say that Jesus died crucifixion. Now, there was even a study done by some MDs, by some doctors, that they actually looked at what would Jesus have actually gone through during the crucifixion. And they concluded that modern medical interpretation of the historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead. Okay, so some people might say, okay, he was crucified, but maybe he just didn't die all the way. But based on the historical evidence and our knowledge of modern medicine, it seems that we can bank on the fact that Jesus actually died on the cross as well. Okay, this is actually published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, I believe. All right, so Jesus probably did die on the cross. There was a person named Jesus of Nazareth who died on the cross. Now, the second fact that you can establish from history, this actually may be surprising, but even a lot of non-Christian scholars would agree with this statement here. And you might say, well, why would they believe the resurrection then? Well, we'll get to that in a second, but a lot of scholars believe that Jesus' disciples they had some sort of experience in which they saw Jesus alive. And this experience happened after he was actually dead. Okay? We'll get to this in a second. Again, how could anyone not believe the resurrection if they believe that? And again, I'll explain that in a minute. But how do we know this? What's some of the evidence that we know this? Well, Jesus' closest friends, the disciples, they first of all claimed that. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, that doesn't mean they're telling the truth, right? People lie all the time, especially in movements, maybe religious movements or political movements or whatever. So we'll get to that in a second, but at least we can say that his closest friends claimed that he was alive after he was crucified. Paul also was maybe a little bit younger, but he was kind of a contemporary of Jesus as well, and he said Christ died for our sins, he was buried, and he rose again the third day, according to the scriptures. And then he lists people that were alive at the time who had claimed to have seen Jesus after he resurrected. So after that, he was seen by Peter, then by the 12, then he was seen by James, then by all the apostles, and last of all, he was seen by me also. Okay, so Paul was close. This is important to realize. He was close to the events, so he knew and interacted with these people. Okay, so if you wanted to find something out, you can, go and email someone today, right? You can, if there's a scientist alive today or historian, if there's someone in Loma Linda, that you want to ask a question, you could go email them, or you could go have a meeting with them, go have coffee with them, right? So Paul was in that position where he was a peer of Jesus and his disciples. So he would have known what was accurate, what events were accurate at the time. Okay. Now, even liberal scholars date 1 Corinthians, the letter that he makes a statement in, they dated it about the 50s A.D., okay, and that's only 20 years after the crucifixion. So again, we're really close to the events here. And a lot of scholars also believe that this specific passage in 1 Corinthians 15 is actually not original with Paul. Paul was actually quoting a creed that was being passed around the Christian community. And scholars believe that creed was within 5 years of the crucifixion. So what Paul quoted here, the source of this statement was within 5 years of the crucifixion. So this is so close to the events themselves. Okay, so this is one of the things that convinces scholars that people did have experiences, legitimate experiences, where they did see Jesus alive after his death, and they even had names of people that were alive at the time. Okay, now what about the fact that the disciples claimed to have seen Jesus alive? Well, here's another example. So James, Jesus' brother, claimed to have seen Jesus alive and became church leader. So if anyone wouldn't be deceived, it would be someone's brother, right? So if a family member close to you dies, what would it take to convince you that that family member was resurrected? Right? You would know. I mean, he was really close. He was Jesus' brother, so he would have known whether or not this was baloney or not, right? He even became a church leader, so he put his life on the line, and he was, he banked his whole life on this belief that his brother rose from the dead. Okay, Polycarp is a disciple of the Apostle John, and he claimed that Jesus rose from the dead as well. So again, these are people close to the events. Clement of Rome talked about Jesus being resurrected. And then, and just a little note here at the bottom here. So yes, we can use the documents of the New Testament, at least consider them as historical documents so we can analyze. And if we're just looking at them as historical documents, we can say there are multiple independent accounts that say that Jesus appeared to the disciples. And they have lists of, he appeared to 12 of them at one time. He appeared to Thomas. Some of you may know the account there. Okay, so there are multiple independent sources within the Gospels and the New Testament that show, or that claim that Jesus did appear. So it is most likely that the disciples actually did claim that they saw Jesus. Okay, so what are our options logically? Okay, if someone comes up to you and says, "I saw Elvis, he resurrected." Okay, what is this thing you're going to think about first? Well, either that person is lying, right? That is a possibility we cannot ignore. Okay, people are not honest for whatever reason. They're trying to get money, or they're trying to get fame, or they're playing a prank, whatever. So we need to take that into consideration. So maybe the 12 disciples and Paul and everyone they were just lying. That is definitely a possibility. We don't want to rule out. Okay. Another possibility is maybe they were misled. Okay, so maybe they're not lying. They thought it was true, but they just misinterpreted their experiences. Okay, that's what a lot of scholars actually argue today, and we can think of that as a hallucination hypothesis. So a lot of scholars say, yeah, they did see something, but it was a projection of their mind. Okay, there was a psychological explanation for it. And then the third option is if they weren't mistaken, then it is possible, right? We're just admitting it's possible the disciples did see Jesus alive, the real Jesus, their friend Jesus. Okay, so that would be the resurrection hypothesis. All right, so these are the three options. So now we want to look at which one is the most reasonable. Okay, were the disciples lying? Okay, so option number one. Let's see what the evidence is for and against that. So here's one reason why I think a lot of even scholars that aren't Christians don't take this hypothesis. And many of Jesus' disciples did risk their lives to preach the resurrection. Okay, some of them were martyred, possibly the majority of them. There's some dispute in that historically, but they at least risked their lives. And some of them were martyred for their faith. Okay, so what this tells now, this doesn't necessarily say that they were correct, but it does say that they believed it, so they weren't lying. Okay, so a lot of people think, well, what about extremist terrorists that, they risk their lives, right? They're going to risk their lives, and they believe they're going to heaven, to go into a building or whatever. Well, they still, that's true, that they're not correct, right? We don't agree, we don't think that they're right about that, but we can say that they truly believe that. All right, so that's the difference. So yes, those extremist terrorists, they believe that that's the case. And that's what drives them to risk their lives for it. Okay, so the disciples would have known whether or not they were lying, right? So because they were willing to risk their lives, that means they actually believed it. Okay, doesn't prove it's true, but it proves they believed it, and that's important. Okay, so yeah, I mentioned that there's some terrorist groups that would die for their beliefs, but once again, no one's disputing that they believe it. That's not the question. But what if someone told them? What if they were convinced that it was a lie? What if someone sat down with a terrorist and said, "Hey, look, this is bogus. This is not true. You're not going to go to heaven for killing people." And then if you're like, "Wow, you're right. That's true. Well, let me go do it anyway." No, that's not going to happen, right? So no one is knowingly going to die for something they know is a lie. All right. So the fact that the disciples were willing to suffer and die for this suggests, not just to Christians, but even to non-Christian scholars, that they at least believed what they were saying. Okay, so they probably weren't lying about it. And there's some traditions about how they died, how they were martyred and all that. And again, I don't know. Some of these I think can be more established historically than others, but the idea is there are some traditions, and at least some of these are probably true, the way that the disciples died for their faith in Jesus' resurrection. And again, this is so convincing even to non-Christian scholars. Here's one example. Gerd Ludemann is a non-religious scholar, or at least he's not a Christian scholar, and he says, it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Okay, so this is what he believes from the historical evidence. And again, you might be thinking, well, how can he not be a Christian if he's saying it? Seems like a really strong statement. We'll get to that next. So how can scholars explain around the fact that the disciples had some experiences that they interpreted as appearances? Okay, but the point I'm making here is that this is well established historically. All right, so the last, option someone has if they don't want to believe in the resurrection is this. There are other explanations. I will say there are other theories too that have been other naturalistic theories that have been proposed. But this is probably the more the popular ones nowadays. A lot of the other ones have kind of lost their popularity. So I guess the next question is, did the disciples hallucinate? Did they make a mistake? Did they see something that wasn't really there? So hallucination, National Institutes of Health definition says it's seeing things such as visions, sounds, or smells that seem real but are not. Okay, these things are created by the mind. Okay, so there's no objective reality behind hallucination. So it's just a projection of your brain. And the hallucination theory is kind of the fashionable one for anyone that wants to avoid the explanation of a miracle. But there are many, many problems with that. And this is actually one of the biggest problems. Okay, so suppose the disciples did have hallucinations. Well, based on their background and theology, they actually wouldn't have been inclined to think of that, therefore Jesus is alive again. Okay, that's something a lot of people don't think about. It's like, just because you see a vision of someone or hallucination of someone, do you conclude that they're back from the grave? Okay, if someone came up to you and said, "Hey, I saw Uncle Jerry the other day. He was haunting my house, and yeah, I saw him. He just walked out of the closet." And then would that person say, "Oh, that must mean Uncle Jerry's alive again. He came out of the grave. Let's go have some food." No, that's not what would work, right? If someone says they've seen their relative or whatever haunting a house, what's their conclusion? Oh, they're communicating beyond the grave, right? Or it's a ghost, or So the disciples would have, obviously their society is not the same as modern culture, but they also weren't expecting people to resurrect, bodily. Okay, so if they had a hallucination, they would have said, "Oh, well, there's Jesus. He's just coming back to communicate with us from heaven. He's telling us to keep fighting the good fight." Okay, so why would that have led them to conclude that there was a resurrection? Okay, that's a really hard problem with this theory. It's a real difficult problem with this theory. In fact, you can even remember in Acts, you remember one of the early Christians, Stephen, when he was being stoned, he looked up and he said, oh, well, there's the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God, right? So he had a vision of Jesus, but he didn't say, well, that means Jesus, he wasn't interpreting that as Jesus presently being there. He was interpreting that as Jesus communicating with him from heaven. Okay, so why would the disciples, to ask yourself that, why would the disciples have interpreted their hallucinations as resurrections rather than just a vision? And there's no good answer for that, in my opinion. Okay, there's also a large diversity of appearances. Okay, so if you take, 100 people in a room, there'll probably be like maybe 5 of them that are susceptible to hallucinations, but having people that were having individuals, having males and females, having friends, enemies, groups, individuals, the diversity of the appearances makes the hallucination hypothesis a little bit less likely. Okay? The other thing is, even if hallucinations did happen, that doesn't really explain why the tomb is empty. That's another historical fact that is pretty well established as well. All right, so it doesn't explain the empty tomb. Okay, so just because they were seeing hallucinations, what would people do? They'd run to the tomb and find out, hey, well, let's see if it's just a ghost or if it's really Jesus. So the hallucination hypothesis does not account for that. So it's weak in that sense. It doesn't account for all of the facts. The other thing is the women were the first to experience the appearances. Okay, now this is important because in that day, the society was more patriarchal, right? So they actually would not have viewed women as far as credibility. I'm not saying this is accurate, but they wouldn't have viewed women, they wouldn't have elevated the testimony of women as much as the testimony of men in that society. So the fact that the sources recorded the women as experiencing Jesus' resurrection appearances first shows that it's probably authentic. Okay, because that would have been an embarrassing detail that they wouldn't have wanted to, they wouldn't have wanted to, if they were just lying and making it up, that would have been kind of embarrassing. Okay, so it wasn't just Peter that did it. Now, another reason this is important is because I've heard some people give the hypothesis that, well, Peter saw it and then he suggested to everyone else. And everyone else was very suggestible, and they all said, oh, okay, well, yeah, maybe Jesus, maybe we did see Jesus. Oh, yeah, look, that cloud does look like Jesus. Look at that. Okay, that's what some people say, that Peter started it out, and then that's what happened. But it wasn't even Peter who was the first one to see Jesus. It was the women. And that is probably an authentic story because it's embarrassing for that day and age. Okay, and another issue is, again, if you take a bunch of people in a room, about 5%, apparently modern research says that about 5% of all people, just imagine that, 5% of everyone has experienced hallucinations for one reason or another. But for Jesus' appearances, it was basically 100% of his closest friends, plus an opponent, plus one of his brothers. Okay, so it kind of stretches the credibility to think that hallucinations can explain all these appearances. Okay, so for this and other reasons, the hallucination hypothesis is very, very weak and not very plausible. Okay, so the other thing is I just want to emphasize that the resurrection is, again, not expected from Jews at that time. They actually believed that there was going to be a final resurrection at the end of the age, but they didn't believe there was going to be anyone was going to resurrect before then. Okay, so their own bias would not have led them to thinking the resurrection happened. Okay, and one historian says, this is why, as a historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Okay, so historians have noted this, and this is further evidence that this was a real event, not a hallucination. All right, so in light of that, can we put together all the conclusions here? So the first fact from history is that there was a man named Jesus from Nazareth who died by crucifixion in the first century. Okay? And this can be established even outside the Bible. And fact two is that Jesus' friends and other peers witnessed appearances after his death. Okay. And the fact three is that it's most likely the appearances were not hallucinations. So we're put into a corner here now, right? We only have really one plausible explanation here. And that's that the best hypothesis is that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead. It was a real event, and it wasn't a hallucination. There was a man named Jesus who died, and then he actually resurrected from the dead. Okay, so I think the historical evidence can establish this pretty effectively. Now, there's just one other thing I just want to talk about here that some people will, just the last slide here, that some may take issue with this, and even as a Christian, you might wonder that. You know, any Christians watching, you know, proving a miracle, that seems like an impossible task. You know, we should just kind of push miracle. If something seems miraculous, we can't prove or disprove that. We just have to kind of put that aside. All right, but the issue is the answer to that is I didn't really even do that in this presentation. And you're saying, wait, what are you talking about? You just talked about resurrection, right? Well, actually, we didn't really, you know, in this presentation, I didn't say that we saw Jesus rise from the dead or anyone actually witnessed the actual resurrection, right? That's the miracle. Okay, I'm not saying that we witnessed the actual miracle. What I'm saying is that we infer the miracle. So we only need to determine if two normal, everyday events happened. Okay, so did Jesus actually die? Is this a normal event? You know, do people die?
Yes.
Yeah, right. You can easily figure that out. If someone died, this is something that's not miraculous. Okay, so did Jesus die? And then the second question is, was Jesus walking around alive after that event? Okay, again, someone walking around and interacting with people is not a miraculous, crazy event. That's something you could verify. So really, all we have to do is establish that Jesus actually died, and then we have to establish that he was walking around afterward. And if you have those two things, you can infer something happened between A and B, obviously. Right? If you reverse these in time, it's not a problem. Someone's walking around and then afterward they're dead. Okay, so that's not surprising. But if these events are this, or this is first and this is second, then there's no other explanation. You're inferring, we can infer that there was a miracle. Okay, so if these two events occurred in that order, then the explanation for those events is a miracle. Okay, so we're not even doing that. We're not even trying to prove a miracle. We're just trying to prove that these two events most likely happened, and then after that we can step outside and say, okay, how do you explain those two events? And I propose to you that the best way to explain those two events is that Jesus actually resurrected from the dead.